This story is titled, When My Neighbor Stole My Dog. My name is Sarah Jenkins, I'm 27 years old, and I live in a quiet neighborhood in Illinois. Well, at least it used to be quiet before the chaos with my dog started. I've always loved this place, the tree-lined streets, the little community park down the road, and the friendly nods exchanged with neighbors during morning walks. But now, every time I step outside, I feel a knot in my stomach. It all started with Max. He's my golden retriever, my best friend, and the heart of my little home. I adopted him 3 years ago from a shelter, and since then he's been my constant companion, through breakups, late-night work deadlines, and quiet Sundays spent curled up on the couch. Max is one of those dogs who seems to have a soul. He's endlessly loyal, with those big brown eyes that make you feel like he understands everything you're saying. One crisp October morning, I let Max out into the backyard while I sipped my coffee. Our yard is fenced in, nothing fancy, but enough to keep him safe while he runs around chasing squirrels or digging up spots I'd just planted flowers in. He always comes back when I call him, tail wagging, tongue lolling, like he's just discovered the greatest secret of the universe. But that morning, when I called him, he didn't come. At first, I wasn't too worried. Max loved to explore, and sometimes he'd get distracted sniffing out some scent or watching a bird. But after 5 minutes turned into 10, I started to panic. I checked the gate. It was locked. There was no way he could have gotten out on his own. My heart pounded as I searched the yard, calling his name louder and louder. That's when I heard it. A bark. Faint but unmistakable. It was coming from the other side of the fence, from my neighbor's yard. My neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, had moved in about 6 months ago. She was in her mid-40s, always impeccably dressed, and had a way of making you feel like she was doing you a favor just by saying hello. We weren't close, but I'd waved at her a few times. I never thought much of her until that moment. I climbed up on a chair to peer over the fence, and there he was. Max, sitting in Mrs. Wilson's perfectly manicured lawn, wagging his tail like nothing was wrong. Relief flooded through me, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. How had he ended up there? I walked over to her front door and rang the bell. It took a minute, but eventually Mrs. Wilson answered. She looked surprised to see me, but her expression quickly turned cold when I mentioned Max. "Oh, you mean my dog?" she said, crossing her arms. I blinked. Sure, I'd misheard her. "Your dog? That's Max. He's my dog." She shook her head, her expression calm and infuriatingly smug. "No, I'm afraid you're mistaken. I've had him for weeks. His name is Buddy, and he's very happy here." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Mrs. Wilson, I've had Max for 3 years. He's microchipped. I have adoption papers. You've seen him with me before." She shrugged, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Well, maybe you've been mistaken all this time. Dogs can wander, you know. Maybe he just decided he liked it here better." I could feel the anger bubbling up, but I tried to stay calm. "Look, I don't know what's going on here, but I'm taking my dog back." That's when she stepped in front of me, her smile turning icy. "If you try to take him, I'll call the police. You can't just barge onto my property and steal my dog." I stared at her, stunned. Was this really happening? I left, my hands shaking, and went straight to the vet to get Max's microchip information printed out. I called animal control, explaining the situation, and they assured me they'd investigate. But by the time they arrived at Mrs. Wilson's house, she had a completely different story. She claimed that Max, Buddy, as she insisted on calling him, had been abandoned. She said she'd found him wandering the neighborhood weeks ago, looking skinny and neglected, and that she'd taken him in out of the goodness of her heart. "She doesn't take care of him," Mrs. Wilson said, pointing at me with this self-righteous tone. "He deserves better than to be locked up in a backyard all day." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Neglected? Max was spoiled rotten. He had a bed in every room, more toys than most kids, and his own little stash of treats in the pantry. But Mrs. Wilson had done her homework. She showed animal control photos of Max in her yard, claimed she'd taken him to the vet for shots, and even had a receipt for a collar she'd bought him. The officers seemed hesitant, like they didn't know who to believe. They told me the matter would have to be settled in court. Court. Over my own dog. The next few weeks were a nightmare. Mrs. Wilson refused to give Max back, and every time I heard him barking from her yard, my heart broke a little more. I barely slept, barely ate, consumed by this desperate need to fix what felt so horribly wrong. And then, to make matters worse, Mrs. Wilson filed a lawsuit against me. She claimed I'd been neglecting Max and that she was suing me for custody of him. The whole thing was surreal. How could someone just take your dog and then turn around and accuse you of being the bad guy? But I wasn't going to let her win. I gathered every piece of evidence I could. Pictures of Max from the day I adopted him, vet records, videos of us playing in the park, even testimonials from friends and neighbors who knew he was mine. When the court date finally arrived, I walked into that courtroom with a mix of determination and dread. Mrs. Wilson was there, dressed to the nines, her lawyer at her side. She played the part of the concerned rescuer perfectly, painting me as some careless owner who didn't deserve such a wonderful dog. But when it was my turn, I told the truth. I showed them Max's microchip records, explained how he'd gone missing from my yard, and shared the overwhelming evidence that he was, without a doubt, my dog. I'll never forget the moment the judge looked at Mrs. Wilson and said, "The evidence is clear. Max belongs to Miss Jenkins." The relief was overwhelming. Mrs. Wilson tried to argue, but the judge wasn't having it. She was ordered to return Max immediately and was given a stern warning about filing false claims. When I finally brought Max home, he acted like no time had passed. He wagged his tail, licked my face, and plopped down on his favorite spot on the couch like he'd never been gone. But for me, everything had changed. Life slowly returned to normal after that, though normal felt a little different now. I couldn't look at Mrs. Wilson's house without feeling a pang of anger, but I did my best to focus on Max and the life we'd fought to get back. Still, every time I let him out in the backyard, I'd find myself standing by the window, watching. I couldn't trust that she, or someone like her, wouldn't try something again. The incident had changed me. It made me realize how vulnerable love makes us. Max, of course, was blissfully unaware of all this. He acted like nothing had happened, bounding around the yard and chasing after the same squirrels he'd been obsessed with since we moved in. Watching him helped ground me. I'd fought for him and I'd won. That was all that mattered. But the story didn't end there. A few weeks after the court hearing, I heard a knock at my door. When I opened it, I was stunned to find Mrs. Wilson standing there, clutching a small bouquet of flowers. For a moment, I thought she'd come to apologize, but the look in her eyes told me otherwise. "Sarah," she said, her voice dripping with forced sweetness, "I came to clear the air. I think we got off on the wrong foot." I crossed my arms, keeping my face neutral. "Did we?" She sighed dramatically, as if she were the victim. "I only did what I thought was right for the dog. You can't blame me for wanting to help an animal in need." "Mrs. Wilson," I said, keeping my voice steady, "Max was never in need. He's always been loved and cared for. You stole him." Her eyes narrowed and the facade cracked just slightly. "Well, I suppose we'll have to agree to disagree." I couldn't believe her audacity. I was about to tell her to leave when Max appeared in the doorway, his tail wagging. He barked once, happily, and Mrs. Wilson flinched. "I think it's time for you to go," I said firmly, stepping in front of Max. She hesitated, her gaze flicking between me and the dog, before finally nodding and walking away. As she disappeared down the driveway, I felt a strange mix of anger and pity. Whatever her reasons, whatever her life was like, it didn't excuse what she'd done. After that, she kept her distance. I'd see her occasionally in the yard or at the mailbox, but we didn't speak again. The whole experience taught me a lot. Not just about the lengths people will go to when they're misguided, but about myself. I realized how much I was willing to fight for the ones I love, even when it felt like the odds were stacked against me. Max is more than just a pet to me. He's family, and family is worth fighting for. If you've ever had someone try to take something or someone you loved, you know how helpless it can feel. But this story is proof that the truth always has a way of coming out. What would you have done in my situation? Have you ever had to fight for something you loved? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your stories. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.